Hi, everybody. Ron Schara here with another Minnesota Bound podcast. I hope you have been enjoying the podcasts recorded so far. Today, we have a very special guest. We're going to talk about bird feeding and a few tips on how to do that. And you couldn't find a better expert, as this guy has a conservation record and a bird feeding record that's unmatched anywhere in Minnesota. Carrol Henderson joins us. Carrol is former, or I should say, retired head of Minnesota's Nongame Program. Carrol, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Well, I'm looking forward to chatting with you, but before we start that, we should remind our listeners that this podcast is brought by four very special sponsors here. We got the Department of Natural Resources. Carrol, your old employer, Department of Natural Resources, of course, is the head agency for managing and regulating all of the things that we find hold dear to us. And then also Connecticut Water. I have Connecticut in my home. I wouldn't be without it. So Connecticut joins us. And Outdoors North Dakota. Outdoors North Dakota has been coming on as a great destination for not only walleye fishing, but bird hunting as well. And then lastly, but not least, my favorite bank for Ron Schara Productions is Star Banks, all throughout western Minnesota. So they are our sponsors. Carrol, I've been a bird feeder not probably as long as you have, and maybe not as involved. My bird feeding consists of 3 or 4 feeders in the backyard, so I can watch them, full of cardinal mix, something you can get in stores, black sunflower seeds, and some suet, and occasionally I put a few other little tidbits out there. But for just getting started, is that about all anybody needs?
That's a good starter, and you hit right on the head the fact that it's good to have multiple feeders out for different foods, and you might even try feeders on different sides of the house, so it disperses the amount of opportunities that birds have to come and feed at your place. I use the black oil sunflower seeds, Niger seed, which brings in the smaller finches, and then safflower. There's a newer kind of safflower out called golden safflower, which the birds really love. So if you haven't tried that yet, that's a wonderful one to try out. It seems to be more edible to a lot of the birds than the white traditional safflower. And then you can attract a lot of birds with sunflower chips and peanut hearts, crushed peanuts, as well as cardinal mix, which brings in a lot of the quality birds like the cardinals that people love at their feeders. And then if you want to, we can talk about some supplemental things to attract birds to the feeders too. Things like bird baths, and then putting your used Christmas trees out on your deck by your feeders, because the birds need that for hiding out when they're not feeding.
Well, that's a good point. Sadly, some of the, I had some kind of, they weren't really an evergreen, but a poplar kind of tree that we had to take down, but the birds were using that. It was only 10 yards from our feeders, and those trees are gone. But I've got some low bushes near the feeders. A lot of chickadees, the other birds, they use that as sort of a stopping point on either going to the feeder or leaving. But that's a real good point, to offer birds some kind of or sense of cover.
Right. And sometimes you can get some used Christmas trees from your own neighborhood when people set them out for recycling. You can put them up on the deck for another couple of months, and you'll see the birds hiding out there between their trips to the feeders. And then also, if you have a bird bath with a thermostat that turns on when it gets cold, birds don't necessarily bathe in the really cold weather, but they do use it for drinking. And as well, suet cakes are important sources of nutrition for the birds. And for the deer hunters in the group, if you cut up those sections of deer ribs, that will attract chickadees and woodpeckers and other birds all winter long.
I laugh at that, Carrol, because I tried that one time, and my wife looked out the window and said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, that's the rib cage of a deer out there." She says, "That's coming down. I'm not looking out the window."
Oops. Yeah, you might want to put that back somewhere where it doesn't show from the windows.
But I keep my suet feeders. I have 3 suet feeders, one on a different tree and 2 on my combination there. And it's joyful to watch the woodpeckers. But I see also chickadees and other birds. Some species utilize the suet as well. And I put it out for another reason. I've got some woodpeckers that, with a cedar-sided house, occasionally they decide they should drill a hole in the side of my house, which is not something I particularly enjoy. So I find the suet, at least in this time of year, distracts them. They leave my house alone.
Yeah, that's an important feature too, because there are woodpeckers that will go after cedar siding occasionally. So that's a problem.
Well, a lot of people think, oh my gosh, I have to do this to save the birds. Now, we all feel sorry for chickadees in the winter when it gets 10 below, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you've said it before that winter bird feeding might help some survival, but mostly it's for our own enjoyment. And if the birds didn't have these feeders, they'd still survive the winter in pretty good shape. Do you still agree to that?
Oh, definitely. There have been studies done, I believe, out in Pennsylvania where they found out that chickadees didn't get more than 20% of their nutrition from bird feeders. The rest of it is from natural foods. And in Minnesota, with the mild fall we've had, some of the traffic at the feeders has been light because the birds are benefiting from all of the natural foods out there. So one of the things that's important is to realize that this is for our enjoyment. It brings the birds up close. And whether you're 5 years old or 95, you get a lot of enjoyment from this, especially during this pandemic era where we're spending a lot of time at home. We can enjoy the birds. And I've had a lot of fun up on our deck this year with photographing the birds coming to feeders and also to pollinator plants with the hummingbirds. So if you have photography as a hobby, it's a great combination with bird feeding.
And I also have a bird ID book close by. So when I look through the binoculars, I see a critter out there. I said, what is that now? Is that, a couple of them are pretty similar. They have little rose colored chests on them. And so it's kind of fun to identify what's coming to the feeders as well.
Right. And in the winter, we do get some nice surprises. We can get pine siskins coming. Some people are enjoying red-breasted nuthatches this winter. And we're also waiting to see if any redpolls may show up, although it seems to be pretty light on those so far. We had a lot of juncos pass through here earlier this fall, but most of those seem to have moved on. But there's always that element of surprise that something will show up, maybe a real spectacular red-bellied woodpecker that will show up that hasn't been too common in the past. So it is good to have a good field guide handy. And also another thing people might like to realize is that there are some bird foods available that aren't really that popular with the birds. There are some foods like red millet, milo or sorghum, wheat and oats and bread that bring in the wrong kind of birds. They bring in the house sparrows and some of the problem birds. So the generic bird food mixes that people might find that are the cheapest bird foods are not necessarily the bird foods that bring in the birds that you really want to attract.
I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of grocery stores, they'll have, here's some bird feed, and it's a little bag, and it's mostly white millet and a few sunflower seeds, and it really is doing a disservice, I think, to people because my experience with white millet, et cetera, is very few birds eat it, so it goes to waste.
Right. The white millet will be used somewhat by the migrant sparrows in the fall and the spring. Its best use is in May and June if you put feeders out for indigo buntings. They love white millet, but that's only for that like a 2-month window in May and June when you can get indigo buntings at your feeder. But otherwise, if you do it in the wintertime or summertime, you can get cowbirds and other species that you're not necessarily trying to attract.
I also have occasionally, it comes to my millet, a pileated woodpecker now. That's a thrill. Those are big birds.
Oh, that's amazing. That's a very impressive bird, and they're not a common visitor at the feeders.
Now, another bird that surprised me the other day, it was not at my feeder, but I've got some crabapple trees in the backyard, and there were 2 robins still flitting around here in December. I go, why aren't you down south basking in the warm?
Yeah, we do have some surprises out there. Robins and sometimes even bluebirds and even mourning doves will stay north longer than they may have in the past. Part of this is because we do put out more fruiting shrubs now than in the past, and the birds benefit from those crabapple trees and other fruiting shrubs that we might have. And then the mourning doves, they will stay at feeders as well, coming to the smaller seed. So some of those birds that we might expect to be heading for Texas have found out that they can make it in winter now.
Yeah, you hear that through the winter, or somebody will get a picture of a robin and say, "Hey, spring's arrived," but a certain percentage of them do spend their winters right here in Minnesota. You kind of go, you scratch your head and say, "What? What are you thinking?" Uh, uh, Before we take a break here, Carol, I want to, you can make bird feeding, especially for somebody as advanced in this in bird life as you are. You can make it as complex, so to speak. It might be the wrong word, but for people who just want to try it, I've always thought that if you just get black oil sunflower seeds, that's really all you need to get started.
Right, that's a good
Do you agree
starter
with that?
food. Birds will find it, and you'll get a lot of visitation there.
What about squirrels?
They can be as much of a nemesis as you can put up with. Squirrels will find your feeding operation, and they will confound many of your efforts to thwart their visits to the feeder. Some people will simply put out additional feeders. I had one friend who would put in several inches of shell corn in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket and just let the squirrels go into the bottom of that bucket and eat until they were ready to pop, and then they would leave. Hopefully, then they wouldn't go visiting so much to the other feeders. But the squirrels are always going to be visiting the more open feeders. But there are some really good feeders out there now that have like a little cage around the feeding cylinder where it keeps, both larger birds and squirrels away from the seed. So those are they're a little bit more expensive, but you're going to use less food there because the squirrels are not stealing your bird food. So watch for those feeders. They're harder to find. They're usually found at the wild bird type specialty stores where they're enclosed. They're going to be much more squirrel proof than some of the other more open feeders that we've used in the past.
Yeah, I've had my share of battles with squirrels, but I also finally got post with that outside shell, as you explained, that the squirrels try to go up it, they get to that, and then they can't go any farther, and they pretty much are content now to just hang around the bottom of the feeder. I noticed blue jays come into some of my bird feeders, and they take their beak and they swing it back and forth. I go, "You're throwing all my good seed on the ground here," and I don't know what they're looking for, but that's good advice. I actually once we did a whole Minnesota Bound TV segment on watching squirrels get to feeders. Even though they can be a pest, you have to admire their acrobatic abilities.
Oh, they're very intelligent, much more than we'd like to give them credit for, and they're determined. And there's a lot more of them out there than we can deal with if we were trying to control them all. So if you can come up with some good squirrel-proof designs, maybe a baffle underneath a feeder on a pole, and then use some of the feeders enclosed in cages, that will reduce the amount of raiding they do on the other feeders. And at some point, you just have to kind of settle down and realize that, well, they're part of the big picture too, and
Here first.
they're to be enjoyed as well.
Carol, stand by here. We're going to take a little break. We'll talk more about bird feeding with you. But first, we have to recognize the folks that bring this program to us. Minnesota's DNR. A lot of folks, almost everybody knows Minnesota DNR because I think it's an agency that most Minnesotans have to deal with in fishing, hunting licenses, the state parks, you name it. But a lot of folks don't know Minnesota's DNR also manages close to more than 1,400 wildlife management areas. They manage them for wildlife, and that they are open to hunting, bird watching, for example, and truly a blessing to this state. You can find out more by going to Minnesota DNR website that would be www.mndnr.gov. WMAS, that's Wildlife Management Areas. So, in addition, I've had Connecticut systems for clean water in my house now for years. I can't praise it enough. Where I live along the Rum River, our water when we moved here was full of iron. It stunk and stained everything. And we discovered Connecticut system, put it in many years ago, and now at our sink we have drinking water that's just as good as anything you're going to find. And it's the Connecticut system doesn't take any electricity, very little salt. It's considered one of the world's most efficient water systems. So I can't speak enough about it. So with that, we'll get back to Carrol Henderson, former DNR head of Minnesota's Nongame program. Carrol, are there some publications for people that are saying, "Hey, I'd like to try this bird feeding, but I'm a little bit still in the dark"? Do you have any suggestion when people can go for more information?
Well, I've spent a number of years working on bird books, including bird feeding books. The one that's been the most popular has been called Wild About Birds, the DNR Bird Feeding Guide. And that one's been out for a number of years. And I think it's probably sold close to 100,000 copies. But now I just learned that a couple months ago, Minnesota's bookstore where they published this has been closed, caused by the pandemic, and it will not be reopening. So there are no more of those books available for sale, but you can go on eBay or alibris.com or abebooks.com and you can buy used copies. But we also have a newer book that just came out in 2015, and it's called Feeding Wild Birds in America. And it's by myself, by Paul Basich and Margaret Barker. It's from the Texas A&M University Press. And that gives a lot of tips about bird feeding and a lot of the history of bird feeding, which is pretty fascinating. For example, 100 years ago, the goldfinch was called the hemp bird because hemp was one of the most popular bird foods in the early 1900s, and the goldfinch really favored that as a type of bird food. So if you look up Feeding Wild Birds in America, Texas A&M University Press, that will have a lot of relatively recent and useful information on bird feeding tips.
I'm glad you mentioned the goldfinch. Because I live along the Rum River, I don't see a lot of them. It's not quite their habitat, I don't think, but I do get a few coming through or hanging around for a while. And it's in the summer, of course, they're that bright yellow, but in the winter, that bright yellow gets into kind of a dull yellow color.
Right, they change their colors in winter, but they're wonderful. And even when I was growing up on our farm in Iowa, my grandfather really liked those birds. He called them the wild canaries. And so they've been popular for a long time, and they're readily birds that come to feeders.
Speaking of feeders, this is a topic we haven't covered, and I've had a little bit of experience. I've bought a feeder, put it out, and don't ask me why, but it just seemed like the birds didn't like it. They wouldn't use it, and I didn't know. I thought, well, maybe the landing wasn't whatever. They didn't like it. I took it down, but so what? Are there good feeders and bad feeders that somebody can get a hold of?
Most of the feeders will work fairly well. The open feeders, the tubular feeders. I think sometimes if people hold on to their bird food too long, it gets stale, and so it ceases to be as attractive. The Niger can sometimes have that problem, or other food can get moldy, or it can get moldy in the feeder. And then you simply need to go clean it out really well and then start with a fresh batch of bird food, and that might bring them around again. Another thing I'd like to mention is that we have about 30-some different species of birds that will come to feeders in Minnesota, and that's what gives us most of our enjoyment at feeders. But we have over 400 species of birds in the state, and many of those other species need specialized habitats like prairie grasslands. They need northern hardwoods forest. They need the boreal forest. They need habitats to be preserved and managed on a larger scale where the birds don't come to the feeders, but they need natural foods, they need natural habitats for nesting and rearing their young. And so there's a need for supporting a lot of our conservation organizations and also supporting the non-game wildlife checkoff on the state tax forms to provide benefits to these broader spectrums of birds that live in Minnesota.
Well, that's well put. I need to remind folks this podcast was brought to you by Outdoors North Dakota. Might be a little late this fall to start planning your hunt to North Dakota, but you can go to legendarynd.com and check about what's happening or plan your hunt next year in North Dakota. And then, of course, can't go without saying hello to Star Bank.
If you're putting your money into mega banks down the street, who knows where that money's being used? Bank locally. Keep your money local with a community bank that actually cares about you, your family, your business, and your goals. Check out the bank we use at Minnesota Bound. Try Minnesota's own Star Bank. You can find them online at starbank.net. When you call Star Bank, you actually hear a real living person answering the phone. Star Bank has 10 convenient locations around Minnesota to serve you and all the mobile banking products that you need to manage your money. Check out all that Star Bank has to offer at starbank.net.
I'm going to ask you what some of your favorite birds that appear at your feeders, but I have to admit that one of my favorites is the chickadee because it's seems to me a very, very friendly bird. I've discovered that as a deer hunter. They would come and sit with me occasionally in the tree, not very far away. But sometimes when I'm going out to refill my feeders and at a time when they're busily using the feeders, they'll be just a couple feet away. They don't seem to care. Then another favorite of mine, and they just seem to come either early in the morning or just before dark, are cardinals that I have coming to my feeder. So of all the birds that you've seen come to your feeders, do you have some favorites?
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, the goldfinches are obviously a great favorite, and also the chickadees, because they come to almost everyone's backyard, and they're a bird that stays with us all year long, and you wonder how can those little birds keep from freezing to death, but they have their ways. Also the cardinal, of course, is wonderful. And one that's a real treat, which doesn't come oftenly, but is really welcome, is the red-breasted nuthatch. And my wife has actually had one experience where she had a coconut that we had cut open on one side and hung it for feeding sunflower seeds. And she had taken it down and was holding the coconut to put more seeds in. And the red-breasted nuthatch flew down and landed on the coconut as she was holding it to feed on the birds, on the seed in the coconut. So the red-breasted nuthatch is one that's irregular, but also a real specialty to enjoy.
You know, something else that people could try. I've been threatening to do this, but I experienced it at a children's conservation camp one winter. They put out, for the lack of a better word, scarecrows, stuffed human clothing stuffed with straw or whatever, and they had them propped up around on chairs around the feeder, and then they would start putting some of the sunflower seeds around the bill of the cap, and these birds started getting used to sitting right on the shoulders and heads of these stuffed scarecrows, for the lack of a better word. And then you could go sit among those with a hat on, and they would come and sit on your head too.
Oh, yes. This is a wonderful way to get children involved with bird feeding. You can put out these scarecrow dummies sitting in a chair with bird seed on open gloves, extended out gloves, and stocking caps. Put the seeds in, and once the birds are welcome and realize that's a good source of food, you can put the kids there, and the kids will have the birds actually landing on them. I've watched this being done up at Itasca State Park when we were having a photography clinic a few years ago, and the kids were just going wild with this. And the other thing, in the book that we did with Feeding Wild Birds in America, we have recipes where people can get together with their kids and mix up some bird feed ingredients to put out for the bird feeders. So kids can get more involved and have a role in attracting the birds to their backyard.
Yeah, indeed. I've tried to make suet once in a while. I think the good suet from a beef was better than the suet I made for some reason.
Yeah, sometimes you can get that directly from a butcher shop where you can get the big, nice chunks of suet for
That's
feeding
what I
your bird.
use.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I go to the butcher shop and ask them if they have some suet. Some places charge for it. Others just give you a bag of it and say, thanks for helping the birds.
Sure.
Carol, before we say goodbye to you, just a couple of things here. You mentioned your favorite birds, and you get kind of bonded to them in a way. Now, my wife and I in February we often leave for a month, and I don't worry about much, but I do worry about my birds. And sometimes I have my daughter and grandson come over and fill the feeders, but they don't quite know the routine. That's probably my fault, but um, my feeders won't last for a whole month. Is that a terrible thing, birds?
Not necessarily. Many of these birds have what you might call a rather nomadic need to keep moving and finding moving food sources because they will find various trees that have food available for maybe a week or two until all the seeds or the fruits are gone, and then they move on. So even though they may be depending on your backyard for some of their food, they may be visiting the neighbors or going nearby and finding other supplemental sources. And because of that nomadic manner, if the feeder doesn't get serviced for a while, once you get back, they'll find it again because they're constantly moving around. They're not going to sit around and just starve to death if a set of feeders goes empty because they have an ability to keep moving, not just a few blocks, but miles and miles. And one of the things that's been different this year is that a couple of the major sites where people have been putting out corn for trumpeter swans over at Monticello and over by Delwood, they stopped feeding the corn this year, and the birds are finding alternative sources of food and spreading out more, which is a good thing too. So these birds will figure it out. Nature will find a way.
Well, thank you for that. I can sleep better at night now.
Good.
One thing I have noticed, and I'm going to let you go, is that in the day, it seems like the birds go in cycles. 1 minute, my feeder station will be as busy as this airport, and the next time I look out there, which seems like forever, nobody's around. And is that? I mean, who says it's time to eat, or how does that work? You know?
Well, that's a big mystery. It happens at our house too. We'll have times where it seems like hours go by and there's not much action, and then you'll get a whole swarm of house finches and other birds starting to feed. I think they hear each other feeding, and it attracts the other birds as well. And I think that's where, if you have a nice variety of bird feeders, and number of feeders at our place may run anywhere from 6 up to a dozen at different times of the year. The more kinds of food you have, the more feeders you have, the more birds it attracts, and it makes it a more constant attraction for enjoying the birds when you do this. And then as spring approaches, it's fun to start planning for various plants and flowers that will supplement the bird foods. So you'll get a lot of birds coming to nectar feeders like the hummingbirds and other birds that are coming to a natural bird bath. If you've got a recycling water pump in the ground with some ponds with different levels where the water is dripping and splashing, that drives the birds crazy. I even had a nice, beautiful golden-winged warbler come to my bird bath in the backyard this spring, which was the first time we've ever had one here in about 40 years.
Wow. Well, Carol, I'm going to let you go. Certainly enjoyed this visit, and I hope the folks, listeners, did too, all about bird feeding. This podcast was brought to you by Outdoors North Dakota. You can go to legendarynd.com, Starbank, Connecticut.com, and of course, the Minnesota DNR website is also just full of all kinds of information. And so with that, Carol, thank you again. And you've been listening to the Minnesota Podcast. I'm Ron Schara.